Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earlier crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. This week I'm going to be using two Picket Fence Studio stamps. This first one is Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, and the second one is Scene Builder Winter Wonderland Trees. Now, my plan here is to create a one-layer scene card using a little bit of masking paper. I'm going to create some hills. I'm going to draw them off with a pencil. You won't be able to see them. And I want to have one of these dancing mice laying on its belly, going down the sled on a hill, and then I'm going to put the trees in between and maybe have a couple of other mice running down the hill. I'm going to do the background snow in purple. I'm going to make the darker shadows with Copic markers and then do some ink blending to create the lighter parts of the snow. And I'm going to create snow banks using a stippling brush and some dollar store white craft ink paint. I'm stamping on Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock with an alcohol marker friendly ink. Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. And I will be coloring the images with a very limited Copic color palette. And this is going to be a kind of a non-traditional Christmas card because it's going to be in hues of purple and green because of the trees. But now that we've talked about the coloring, let's jump into the crime. Our alphabetical journey today takes us back to the state of Florida. Now, the area that became Florida has a long history. Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon is given credit for discovering Florida in 1513, but evidence shows that native tribes were there long before the Europeans started their explorations. And the Spanish attempts to colonize Florida were not successful. The search for gold and other riches led to major conflicts with the native tribes that had already been there. And the first settlement was actually destroyed by a hurricane and then abandoned. Fast forward to 1763, and Spain trades Florida to Great Britain for control of Havana, Cuba. Havana had fallen to British rule during the 7 Years' War, and Spain wanted it back. The area that eventually became the colony and then the state of Florida was created in 1767 when the 13 original colonies declared independence from Great Britain. And when that independence by the other colonies was announced, a lot of people in Florida condemned it. At that time, Florida was separated into East and West Florida and was populated mostly by British personnel and their families. They didn't do much trading with the other colonies, and so they were not greatly affected by the Stamp Act of 1765 and other taxation policies from the British government. After the Revolutionary War and the departure of the British employees or government people living there, the rule of Florida returned to Spain until the 1820s. On March 3rd of 1822, Florida became a territory of the U.S., and East and West Florida were united into one area. Wow, y'all, words are hard today. And they were annexed into the existing territories in the region, so like the Mississippi, Louisiana territories. The time between territory and statehood was rife with wars with the Native American tribe who protested being removed from their sacred homelands. In the end, after spending somewhere between 20 and 40 million American dollars, most of the members of the Seminole tribe were in fact exiled to lands west of the Mississippi, and Florida moved toward statehood. On March 3rd, 1845, Florida became the 27th state to join the Union. Some other interesting facts about Florida. No matter where you go in Florida, you are never more than 60 miles from the ocean. It is illegal to sing while wearing swimwear in public. It is also illegal for an unmarried woman to skydive on Sundays. Gatorade was named after the University of Florida's football team, the Gators, where the drink was first developed. The first ATM was installed in Miami, and it was designed to keep rollerbladers out of the banks, or for the use of rollerbladers who were not allowed in the banks, I guess is a better way to say that. Florida is the only place on Earth where alligators and crocodiles coexist in the same habitat. I didn't know that one. Tampa's Bayshore Boulevard is the world's longest continual sidewalk. Once a year, thousands of Floridians stand at the state line and toss dead fish into Alabama. It's called the annual Mullet Toss, and it's hosted by the Floribama Beach Bar in Pensacola. The area code 321 has been in service since November 1st of 1999 in Brevard County, Florida, and it refers to the countdown sequence 321 at the Kennedy Center where spacecraft are launched. In Cape Coral, it is illegal to park a pickup truck in your driveway or in front of your house on the street. Not sure where you're supposed to put your pickup trucks, because everybody knows your garage is for storage, not vehicles. Benjamin Green, a Miami pharmacist, invented the first suntan lotion. And there are 31 lighthouse structures still standing in Florida. And Florida had some hinky happenings at some of those lighthouses. With over 1,300 miles of coastline, Florida had a need for lighthouses. They were even lighting houses or lighting crews set up along the intercoastal waterways that dominated the Florida habitat. In 1789, the United States created the U.S. Lighthouse Society as part of the Treasury Department as a vital part of the new nation's security and economy. Lighthouses were erected along the coastlines of Florida to prevent the ships traveling around the peninsula from crashing into reefs and jagged shorelines. There were also lighting houses along the major rivers to prevent the same thing. Until 1896, lightkeepers and their assistants were political appointments, and then they became like regular Govy jobs, civil service jobs. Lighthouses usually had two keepers, a keeper and an assistant, and they lived on the grounds in homes built for them and their families. The average pay was $440 annually plus room and board, and this was a covetable position. Lighthouses and lighting houses were maintained by the federal government by the mid-1800s, so it was a guaranteed paycheck unless in certain times. The differentiation between lighthouses and lighting houses is location. Lighthouses were on the coast and lighting houses were in the rivers. Now, Ernest Marler was born on December 1st of 1899 to William and Camilla Marler, the oldest of their 12 children. 12. William was the town founder of Destin, Florida, been there, and had been appointed as the lighthouse keeper of the, I'm going to butcher this, Choctawhatchee Range Lighthouse near Destin. Ernest and his siblings grew up around the sea and lighthouses. In fact, being lighthouse keepers ran in their family. They had grandfathers and uncles and cousins who all made their livings either as lighthouse keepers or as fishermen. They were they're Floridians. They made their living in connection with the sea. Ernest grew up and met and married Susie Stevens. They were married in 1924, and they had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. In 1933, okay, let me pause for a minute here. I know there's not a lot of backstory because I couldn't find it. I found this story. It was super well written, but I couldn't find the background. Okay. In 1933, a man named Sullivan White was appointed as the lighthouse keeper after having previously served as the assistant. He served as the assistant to a man whose name I forgot to write down, who actually committed suicide. So Sullivan was promoted, and then Ernest was appointed as the assistant keeper. So He moved Susie and their children into the assistant keeper's house at the Cape San Blas lighthouse, and all seemed to be normal. The lighthouse was lit from sunset to sunrise, with either the keeper or the assistant awake during the night to make sure that the light stayed on. The day chores included making sure there was fuel for the lamps, the cleaning of the reflectors that shine the light out to sea, the upkeep on the lighthouse buildings, and then regular family chores, wood chopping, gardening, all the things you had to do in the early 1900s to maintain your family. So the morning of March 16th, 1938 started out the same. Sullivan and Ernest finished the lighthouse day chores, and Ernest went to work in the workshop behind his home, and Sullivan took his wife into town. And Sullivan and his wife left about 9 o'clock in the morning, and then and it was about 10 when Ernest headed into his workshop. His plan was to work until their midday meal. This was the time frame when lunch was the biggest meal of the day. And so, yeah, he was going to go work until the midday meal. Well, at about 2:30, when Ernest had not shown up for lunch, Susie sent their daughter, Mamie Sue, out to check on Ernest and tell him to come and eat. And Mamie Sue quickly returned, reporting to her mother that her daddy was hurt. So Susie headed out to the workshop and was greeted with, well, a bloodbath. Ernest was on the floor near his workbench, surrounded by a 3-foot pool of blood. The examination would show that he had been stabbed 13 times in the chest, once in the throat, and one hand was almost severed at the wrist. Susie ran from the workshop to the keeper's house to get Sullivan, the lighthouse keeper, and Sullivan and Susie returned to the workshop, and Susie ran to Ernest and threw her arms around her husband, crying, quote, "Oh, darling, why did you do it?" She had only seen the cuts to Ernest's wrist and thought that he too had committed suicide. Now, Sullivan had the same initial thought. So he looked at Ernest's body. He noticed that he was stiff and the blood was clotting. And he actually, when they had walked into the workshop, picked up a knife. And when he realized what was going on and what he had done, he replaced the knife where he found it and then went to go get the police or phone the police. So Gulf County Sheriff B.E. Parker arrived at the lighthouse at about 4:30 p.m., and he was accompanied by the county judge, Judge Alton Denny, or R. Alton Denny, lots of initials. Sheriff Parker examined the scene and questioned the idea of suicide. It was apparent to him that Susie and Sullivan hadn't seen anything but the wound to Ernest's wrist. They had not noticed the stab wounds to his chest and his throat. So the sheriff picked up the knife that Sullivan had picked up from the ground and a hatchet that was laying nearby, and he wrapped them up and intended to send them to Washington for fingerprint analysis. Keep in mind that lighthouse keepers were a federal job, so there was federal jurisdiction here. And I suppose in 1938, the FBI had the best fingerprint techniques, right? So the sheriff noted that there wasn't just a pool of blood around Ernest. It was everywhere. It was splattered around the workshop. It was on the toolbox on the whole other side of the room. It was on the floor. It was under the workbench. It was just everywhere. And the Sheriff Parker came to the conclusion that Ernest had been attacked and then tried to pull himself toward the door in an attempt to either get away or to get help. But because of the wounds, he did not have the energy and just fell to the floor and bled out and died. So Sheriff Parker doubted that the deep wounds inflicted in inflicted in Ernest's chest could have been self-inflicted, and the local doctor, Dr. Barty, agreed. So there was a coroner's inquest held on March 16th, and Dr. Barty said, quote, "It would not be possible for a man to stab himself so many times and then practically cut his wrist in two. For a man to cut his wrist so deeply and then stab himself or cut himself 14 times in the chest and throat." So he is saying that neither scenario could have happened. He couldn't have cut his wrist and then stabbed himself, or stabbed himself and then cut his wrist. It just would not have been possible. At the end of his testimony and the testimony of the sheriff, they concluded the inquest, and no verdict was returned. So they just said, "Yeah, we don't know what happened. We're just gonna let this one go." So Dr. Barty called for a second inquest jury after further examination. Testimony at that trial, that inquest, was still completely unhelpful. There was no clear motive for suicide. There was no clear motive for murder. Ernest's uncle, Clem Brooks, dismissed rumors of there being money trouble, and his evidence for that was that Ernest had just been approved for a bank loan. So if he had money problems, the bank's not going to be loaning him any money. Yeah, that made sense. Any money. Sorry. Susie and her 13-year-old daughter, Ernestine, she was their oldest child and their oldest daughter, testified that there was no reason they could think of that Ernest would take his own life. He just was not, it was not logical to them. Sullivan White, the lighthouse keeper, also, when he was informed of the other wounds, retracted his original thinking of suicide. And he changed his mind, or when he changed his mind, he was asked if he was afraid for his own life. And he replied, quote, "Yes, I am afraid because I believe someone is trying to get our jobs. Several threats have been made to previous keepers by persons wanting the job at the lighthouse." Again, this is the 1930s. The federal government is a guaranteed paycheck. And at this time in Florida, most people's income was tied to the sea, and it just wasn't a great time. So there were, of course, some other theories that came out in these few days surrounding Ernest's death. One theory was moonshiners. Moonshiners tended to be suspicious of government workers, and we talked about this last season, how the government had decided that moonshiners were going to pay taxes, and the tax collectors got to decide how much tax each still owner had to pay. So moonshiners were suspicious of government workers, and they may not have been able to separate the lighthouse keepers from these tax collectors. That was the theory. Another theory was that thieves had gone into the workhouse, the shop, looking for money or valuables. I don't know about you, but I don't keep my valuables in the shed out back. I'm just saying. At the end of the testimonies of the second inquest, a verdict was returned, and it read, quote, "Death at the hands of a party or parties unknown." So the second inquest determined that Ernest had been killed by somebody, but who was unknown and why was unknown. Susie and her children were named as possible suspects because of domestic dispute. But again, there was no evidence that kind of animosity was in the home. There was no evidence that there had been domestic problems between Ernest and Susie or their children. There was one other theory that was floated around that I read one time, and there was no other real information about it. Some people suggested that the murder may have been retaliation because Ernest was testifying against someone for something. But that was all the information that was given. The murder was retaliation for his testimony. Okay, so weird enough, right? Ernest was laid to rest in Destin, Florida, and eventually his mother and his 11 siblings have been buried there as well. Sullivan White was transferred to the Cape San George Lighthouse in 1939. He did not stay working at that particular lighthouse. Susie and her children moved to Gulf County, at least according to the 1940 census. The keeper who replaced Sullivan White at the Cape San Blas Lighthouse had come from the South Pass West Jetty Lighthouse, and he was named Frank Spongia, and he actually believed that a local man named Johnny Jones was the one who had killed Ernest. But in what I read, he didn't say why. So I wonder if that had to do with the testimony thing. I don't know. That's just my speculation. Don't have any reason except speculation to throw that out there. Sullivan testified at the second inquest hearing that he feared for his life. And it wasn't an unfounded fear. The lightkeeper job was one of the few maritime jobs that had a regular income, and people wanted the guaranteed paycheck. And just because I have a very healthy disregard for coincidences, we're going to back up to the month before the death of Ernest, and we're going to go all the way across the state to the Volusia Bar Lighting House Station. Okay. The Lighting House Station was what they called the light points or the towers along the rivers in Florida. And there was a light attendant, is what they were called, and they would be responsible for a cluster of buoys, pole lights, and day markers. And they lived on the mainland, and then they took a canoe or a motorboat or rowboat and paddled up and down or motored up and down the river to check their lights, to turn them on and off in the morning and at night. So there was a gentleman named A.J. Anderson, and he had been at one time the assistant keeper at the Battery Gladden Light in Alabama, but for reasons I could not determine, he resigned in 1833. I will tell you that I do not know exactly when A.J. or where A.J. was born. No information on his family, nothing. Anyway, A.J. was reportedly really well liked by fishermen, and they referred to him as Old Man Anderson. So he must have been older than average. After A.J. resigned from being the assistant keeper in Alabama, he took a job as the light attendant at Lake George in 1935. And he had 5 sets of river lights and the set of range lights used to line up the boats in the channel. That was his post. At that time, most of the traffic there was sportsmen, so fishermen. He lived an isolated life on the island there, but he liked it that way. He liked being there by himself. Now, on February 6th, just like 5 weeks prior to Ernest's death, A.J. had lunch with some local fishermen on the mainland. And that night, the lights did not go on in the channel. And when 3 days had passed and the lights still had not come on, people were sure something terrible had happened to A.J. So on the 9th of February, the Volusia County Deputy Sheriff Stearman took a boat out to the light attendant station with, so that's the deputy sheriff. Deputy Sheriff Stearman got a boat, and the sheriff was Sheriff Codrington, and they went out to the attendant station, and when they got there, it was a mess. There was blood on the bed frame, the mattress, the floor, the porch, the front walk, but there was no sign of A.J. anywhere. And it seemed kind of obvious to them that this was the scene of an attack. The sheriff and the deputy initiated a search of the lake and the surrounding areas, and after 2 days, there was no sight of AJ. There was nothing. So on the 12th, the day after the search was called off, some fishermen about 200 yards from the station house found the body of a man floating in shallow water. The deputy sheriff was called out, and it was a surprise to no one that it was AJ. But the surprise was that he was right where they had been searching. So apparently, over the course of a couple of days, his body had floated to the surface. Now, the county doctor, Dr. Knapp, was called out to examine AJ's body, but there was nothing really he could determine without an autopsy. The county judge declined to call an inquest jury or to even call for an autopsy. He didn't think enough evidence was strong enough to warrant an investigation. Side note here, one of the headlines in the newspapers the same time in that area was about whether or not there was enough funds in the county to pay school teachers that month. So I would suggest that maybe the reason there was no inquiry or autopsy was because of lack of money. However, on February 16th, so it was the month before Ernest, the federal government took over jurisdiction because, again, federal job. And the FBI sent Agent Thomas McDade to investigate. So Agent McDade and Deputy Stearman went back to the lighting station. And when Agent McDade saw the scene, he immediately filed a request to have AJ's remains exhumed and autopsied. So on the 18th, the exhumation order was granted. Dr. Hahn testified that after examining AJ's remains, the cause of death was a dislocated neck, but it was impossible to tell how the dislocation occurred, whether it was from an attack or a fall. But there wasn't any evidence of signs of damage to the skull. But everything else was too composed or bloated from being in the water for there to be any evidence remaining. Deputy Stearman testified about the condition of the attendant station, but he and the doctor were the only witnesses called. The jury did not call the FBI agent, even though he was slated as a witness. And at the end of the inquest testimony, Judge Peacock adjourned without finding any verdict. Agent McDade left the night of the 18th when the jury failed to return a verdict. And he did make a mention of this case in one of his notebooks. But that was all that was ever done in the case of A.J. Anderson's mysterious death. There was some people surmised that because AJ was at least 70, he may have hit his head, become disoriented, and after walking out of the house in the front yard, fell into the water. Possible, except that there was no damage to the skull. Lake George was an isolated place and would have been an easy place for a surprise attack to occur. And again, coveted job, guaranteed paycheck. If an opening came up, somebody had to fill it. So, my crime brain goes a lighthouse keeper and a lighting house attendant, 2 people, and 3 if you want to count the suicide of the first keeper that we talked about, Sullivan White's. When Sullivan White was the assistant, right? So, but two keepers or attendants in 5 weeks' time. They're dead. Mysteriously dead, bloody dead, horrible scene dead, and they're not related? Okay. My spidey sense tells me, yeah, they are. They have to be. How can it possibly be that these 2 men who had similar jobs, guaranteed paychecks, one who lived by himself and the other who didn't, but I don't know. And here's another thing in my mind that's sticking. So the man who was the lightkeeper, whose name I forgot to write down, when Sullivan was the assistant, sorry, excuse me, his death was ruled a suicide. But if you look at the wounds that Ernest sustained, it seems like maybe somebody was trying to make his death look like a suicide as well. Now, I wasn't there. I didn't see the evidence. They didn't have photographs and stuff. So I am making huge suppositions here. Total guess. But I just find it so incredibly suspicious that at least 2 men, maybe 3, who did the same type of job in the same area died in not too many months from each other. Like, Sullivan had been promoted to lighthouse keeper for about a year. Let me check the dates in my notes. Sullivan was promoted to lighthouse keeper in 33, and then Ernest was killed in 38, and AJ was also killed in 38. So I guess it's a 5-year difference, so maybe there's not a link there. But, gosh, how could there not be a link between Ernest and AJ? 5 weeks? I don't know. I just am highly suspicious that those are unrelated. I don't know. You guys tell me, what do you think? I mean, this is the stuff that makes my brain run around in circles, especially when we're talking these unsolved things. Like, I don't know. I just feel like they had to be related. And if the FBI investigated AJ's death, why didn't the FBI investigate Ernest's death? That's another conundrum that's running around my brain. They sent somebody out for AJ. Why didn't they send somebody out for Ernest? I don't know. Things that make you go hum, right? Short story, not a lot of details, but good story. And I have pictures of 2 of the newspapers at the time that talked about Ernest's death. I could not find any information in newspapers on AJ's death. And I have a picture of what a lighting house probably looked like, although AJ's was on mainland. So, anyway, thanks for hanging out with me today. Thanks for listening to my story. I have a couple of other videos here for you to watch. I've also added that subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. Tell me what things are rolling around in your brain. Give me a thumbs up and have a really fabulous day.